The first time I saw that pearl gray SUV roll over my grandfather's hand-carved turkey decoy, I figured whoever was driving had simply taken a wrong turn. Then, the driver's door swung open. A woman stepped out wearing hiking boots that had probably never touched real mud before, and she looked around my family's mountain like she was inspecting a shopping mall she had just purchased. She smiled, tucked a clipboard under her arm, and said, "Good afternoon. I'm Elaine Prescott, president of Pine Hollow Estates HOA. As of today, this access road falls under community oversight." Honestly, I couldn't help it. My family had owned that mountain since my great-grandfather came home from World War II with nothing but a pickup truck and enough savings to buy 200 rough acres nobody else wanted. Yet somehow this woman standing in designer sunglasses believed a subdivision built 3 valleys away gave her authority over our land. That laugh must have embarrassed her, because the smile disappeared from her face almost instantly. "Sir," she said in that practiced customer service voice people use right before becoming difficult, "I'm not asking for your opinion. I'm informing you of the new regulations." Looking back now, I realized that moment changed everything. Some people fight because they want money. Some fight because they want revenge. Elaine fought because she couldn't tolerate the idea that there was one piece of land she couldn't control. And I fought because I couldn't let 4 generations of my family's history disappear behind somebody else's clipboard. My name is Mason Carter, and until that morning my biggest concern had been whether the wild turkeys were moving farther uphill after an unusually warm spring. I lived alone in the old cedar cabin my father rebuilt 20 years earlier, about 45 minutes from the nearest grocery store, and that was exactly how I liked it. My mornings started with coffee on the porch, listening to the creek below, watching deer wander through the trees while the sun slowly burned away the mountain fog. Cell service barely existed. The nearest neighbor sat almost 2 miles away. And silence wasn't something you searched for. It simply lived there with you. The mountain had its own rhythm, one that never cared about meetings, committees, or neighborhood politics. Unfortunately, the world below had started creeping upward. Pine Hollow Estates had exploded over the previous 5 years. Expensive vacation homes replaced old cattle fields. Retirees from the city arrived with electric SUVs and expensive outdoor furniture. And somewhere along the way, they convinced themselves the entire mountain was simply waiting to become another amenity. They built walking trails, picnic shelters, decorative signs, and observation decks, none of which bothered me because they were all on their own property. Then Elaine became HOA president. People later told me she'd spent 30 years climbing the corporate ladder in some regional insurance company before retiring early. She loved policies, procedures, color-coded binders, and the feeling that every problem could be solved if enough rules existed. Maybe that worked in an office. Mountains don't care about office rules. I leaned against my truck and asked her one simple question. "Who told you this road belongs to your HOA?" She flipped through her binder without looking at me. "According to our expansion proposal, this corridor serves community recreational interests." "That's interesting," I said, "because according to the county deed sitting inside my cabin, this road belongs to my family." She finally looked up. "Documents can become outdated." I almost laughed again. "Lady, granite becomes outdated slower than property deeds." Her face tightened. Behind her, 2 HOA volunteers shifted awkwardly, obviously wishing they were somewhere else. Elaine ignored my comment and continued talking as if she were reading from a script. She informed me I would soon receive notices requiring permit applications for hunting activity, restrictions on vehicle access, and architectural reviews for my cabin. She even mentioned possible annual maintenance fees for using my own road. My own road. I remember staring at her for several seconds because I honestly couldn't decide whether she was serious or performing some elaborate prank. Finally, I said, "You should probably head back down before that mountain humbles you." She smiled again, but this time it wasn't friendly. "We'll see who humbles who." Then she climbed back into her SUV, threw the transmission into drive, ignored every wooden private property sign she'd just passed, and accelerated farther uphill. About 300 yards beyond my cabin, the old logging trail narrowed. Years earlier, I'd installed removable tire spikes across one section whenever hunting season ended. They weren't traps. They were clearly marked security devices used to stop trespassers from driving deeper into the preserve. Everyone local knew they existed. Elaine didn't. 4 loud pops echoed through the trees less than 30 seconds later. Birds exploded from the branches. I closed my eyes, took one slow sip of coffee that had somehow stayed warm through the entire conversation, and quietly muttered, "Well, I did warn her. Elaine's SUV sat sideways across the old logging trail with all four tires flattened, looking strangely out of place against the pines and moss-covered rocks. By the time I reached her, she was pacing in circles with her phone held high, desperately searching for a signal that didn't exist. She spun toward me the second she heard my boots crunching across the gravel. "You did this," she shouted before I even opened my mouth. I looked at the tires, then at the bright yellow warning sign mounted to the cedar post less than 15 feet away. It read, "Private road. SEC Yurdi Spikes ahead. Our Rizid Vehicles only." The sign wasn't hidden behind bushes or faded with age. It was freshly painted because I'd replaced it the previous spring. I simply pointed toward it. She glanced at it for half a second before looking away. "Your sign is irrelevant." I couldn't help smiling. "Funny, your HOA rules seem pretty irrelevant up here too." That only made her angrier. She demanded I pay for a tow truck, new tires, and emotional distress. Emotional distress. I actually repeated those words out loud because I wasn't sure I'd heard them correctly. "Ma'am," I said as calmly as I could, "you standing almost 4 miles inside private property after driving past 3 no trespassing signs and 1 locked gate you forced open. I don't think you're in a position to invoice anybody." She crossed her arms. "We'll let the lawyers decide." I nodded. "Please do." Then I turned around and walked back toward my cabin while she yelled something about lawsuits echoing through the trees. 2 hours later, a recovery truck finally crawled up the mountain, and by sunset her SUV was gone. But unfortunately, so was any chance this would end with a flat tire. The first certified letter arrived 5 days later, then another, then another. According to Pine Hollow Estates, my cabin violated newly adopted architectural standards. My roof color was unacceptable. My porch railing supposedly presented a safety concern. My firewood stacks were considered visual pollution. They even cited me for keeping hunting equipment visible from neighboring properties that happened to be nearly 2 miles away. I pinned every letter to the wall above my desk without responding. My father always said that paperwork tells a story long before people do. If someone insists on putting their bad decisions in writing, let them keep talking. My closest neighbor, Walter Briggs, stopped by one afternoon carrying homemade blackberry pie his wife insisted I take. Walter was 74, retired from the National Security Agency decades earlier, and somehow managed to look like the friendliest grandfather alive despite having spent most of his career doing things he refused to discuss. He stood in my kitchen reading the growing collection of HOA notices before letting out a quiet whistle. "She's not trying to fine you," he said. "She's building a paper trail." I looked over, meaning he tapped the latest violation. "Someone wants to argue you're creating a nuisance." Enough nuisance complaints become leverage. Leverage becomes pressure. Pressure makes people sell. That thought settled in my stomach heavier than I wanted to admit. My family's land had become incredibly valuable. Developers had been trying to buy sections of the mountain for years. We'd always refused. I suddenly wondered if Elaine's obsession had less to do with rules than with real estate. A week later, things became even stranger. I found a trail camera zip tied 30 feet up a pine tree overlooking my driveway. At first, I assumed it belonged to wildlife researchers, until I climbed up and noticed the lens wasn't aimed toward the forest. It pointed directly at my front porch. 2 days later, I discovered another one overlooking my equipment shed. Then, another hidden inside a fake birdhouse near the creek crossing. Whoever installed them knew exactly where people walked. Walter examined one over coffee. He turned it over in his hands for several minutes before shaking his head. "This isn't sold at your local sporting goods store. How can you tell?" "Power system, encrypted storage, directional antenna, expensive hardware." He handed it back. "Whoever paid for these wasn't trying to watch deer." That conversation stayed with me all week. Then my old friend Nick Holloway came by. Nick had retired from the Marine Corps after 26 years and treated every problem like a mission briefing. He listened quietly while Walter explained what we'd found, then unfolded a county map across my kitchen table. "Forget the cameras," Nick said. "Think about what they're protecting." He circled several locations where the cameras had been hidden. "Notice anything?" I stared for nearly a minute before realizing every camera pointed toward one narrow ridgeline farther east. None of them watched the road leading down toward the subdivision. Every one of them watched traffic heading deeper into my family's property. Walter smiled slightly. "Exactly. The following Saturday, the three of us hiked toward that ridge before sunrise. We weren't looking for trouble. We were looking for answers." About an hour into the hike, Walter stopped walking. "Hear that?" At first I heard nothing except birds and wind. Then, a faint electrical hum. Completely unnatural. Mountains have sounds. Flowing water, leaves, insects, coyotes after sunset. Electricity doesn't belong on a remote ridge with no power lines. We followed the sound another quarter-mile until the trees opened into a small clearing I had somehow never visited, despite spending most of my life on that mountain. Sitting against the hillside was a weathered utility shed, no bigger than a one-car garage. From a distance, it looked abandoned. Up close, it wasn't. Fresh tire tracks crossed the mud. Solar panels peeked through camouflage netting. Cooling fans quietly pushed warm air through hidden vents. Nick crouched beside the entrance. Somebody's here often. Walter adjusted his glasses, studying a thick cable disappearing underground. Whatever this is, it isn't legal. We didn't force the door open. We didn't touch anything. Instead, we photographed everything from every angle before hiking back home. That's when Elaine made her biggest mistake. 3 days later, she appeared in my cabin with 2 sheriff's deputies. She greeted me with a smile that looked rehearsed. "Mr. Carter," she said sweetly, "we've received reports that you're trespassing on HOA property." I actually laughed so hard one of the deputies smiled. "Deputy," I asked, "would you mind telling me whose name appears on the county deed for this parcel?" The younger deputy checked the paperwork in his truck for several minutes before returning. "Actually, Mr. Boundary, Carter owns this entire section." Elaine interrupted immediately. "Those records are being challenged." The older deputy folded his arms. "By who?" She hesitated just long enough for both deputies to notice. "The Homeowners Association." He looked around at the untouched forest stretching for miles before calmly saying, "Ma'am, homeowners associations don't rewrite county property records." She didn't answer. She simply climbed back into her replacement SUV and drove away without another word. Watching her disappear down the mountain, Walter quietly said something I never forgot. "People hiding something always panic when facts arrive before they do." At the time, I assumed he meant the cameras. But within 48 hours, we discovered that the little shack on the ridge was only the surface of something much larger. And once we started pulling on that thread, the entire carefully constructed image Elaine had built inside Pine Hollow Estates began unraveling faster than anyone in the county could have imagined. The county investigators arrived less than a week later. And for the first time since this whole mess had started, I wasn't the one explaining anything. Walter handed over copies of every photo we'd taken. Nick provided GPS coordinates for the hidden structure, and I walked them through the timeline, beginning with Elaine's first visit to my cabin. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody made dramatic accusations. We simply laid the facts on the table and let them speak for themselves. Within 2 days, the area around that little shack was taped off. Utility contractors showed up with equipment I'd never seen before, and several unmarked government vehicles climbed the mountain before sunrise. Rumors spread through Pine Hollow Estates faster than wildfire. Some people claimed it was an illegal communications relay. Others insisted someone had been collecting data without permits. Whatever the truth was, one thing became obvious almost immediately. The structure had never been approved by the county, and it certainly wasn't built on HOA property. It sat squarely on land belonging to my family. Elaine suddenly stopped sending violation notices. My mailbox, which had been overflowing with certified letters for nearly 2 months, stayed completely empty. That silence told me more than any attorney ever could. Then came the monthly HOA amendment meeting, the very meeting where Elaine had planned to expand the association's authority over neighboring landowners. The community center was packed well before the meeting started. Homeowners filled every chair. Reporters stood along the back wall. And even people who normally avoided HOA politics showed up because everyone had heard pieces of the story. Elaine walked to the podium wearing the same polished smile I'd seen on my driveway weeks earlier. But this time it looked forced. She thanked everyone for attending and began reading through the agenda as though nothing unusual had happened. She never made it past the second item. A county official quietly stood, introduced himself, and asked if the board would allow him 5 minutes before the vote. The room went completely silent. He projected aerial photographs onto the screen behind Elaine. First came the hidden shack, then the network of concealed cameras, then survey maps showing property boundaries. Finally came copies of county records confirming that neither the structure nor the surveillance equipment had ever received authorization, and that every installation sat outside HOA jurisdiction. You could almost hear people holding their breath. Someone in the audience finally asked the question everyone was thinking. Who approved all of this? Nobody answered right away. Elaine stared at the screen for several long seconds before lowering her eyes. The confidence she'd carried onto my mountain that first morning had completely disappeared. One board member quietly admitted the cameras had never been discussed during official meetings. Another said he had signed paperwork believing the equipment was temporary trail monitoring. Homeowners who had defended Elaine for years suddenly realized how little they actually knew about decisions being made in their name. The vote to suspend her authority happened that same night. A formal investigation followed. Several board members resigned over the next few weeks, and Pine Hollow Estates spent months rebuilding trust inside its own community. I never celebrated any of it. Honestly, watching someone lose everything isn't nearly as satisfying as movies make it seem. Standing on my porch a few days later, I looked across the same mountain my great-grandfather had walked decades earlier, listening to the creek and watching the evening light settle over the ridgeline. The mountain hadn't changed. The trees didn't care about HOA meetings. The deer still crossed the trail at sunset. Life quietly returned to the rhythm it had always known. Walter stopped by with coffee one morning and smiled toward the valley below. "Funny thing about mountains," he said. "People think they can conquer them. Usually they just expose themselves trying." I laughed because he was right. Elaine never really lost it. She lost to her own belief that authority mattered more than truth. If she'd simply respected a property line, none of this would have happened. Instead, every decision she made pushed her one step closer to the moment when facts finally caught up with her. Every now and then, someone asks whether I regret refusing to compromise that first day. My answer never changes. Property can be measured in acres, fences, or survey pins, but respect can't. Once you surrender that, getting it back becomes a whole lot harder than defending it in the first place. Still, I know not everyone sees stories like this the same way. Some people think I should have ignored her. Others believe Elaine deserved everything that happened after crossing that line. So now I'd like to hear from you. If someone claimed authority over land your family had protected for generations, how far would you go to defend it? Was Elaine simply enforcing rules she believed were valid, or did power blind her to basic common sense? Share your thoughts in the comments because I'm genuinely curious where you stand. And if you enjoy stories about property rights, community conflicts, and ordinary people standing their ground without backing down, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.